Most humans want to live as long as possible, but unfortunately, they don't get to live as long as they'd like. But what if science made it possible to add an extra 75 years to the lives of people who would normally die at 75? In other words, you could live to 150. What if you could live to 3,000? What if you could be immortal and only die if you chose to die? All these questions are about the ethics of life extension, which I think are fascinating. Socrates held that philosophy and its study was to prepare you for death. And so part of this is thinking about death, but it's also thinking about what would happen if we didn't die. So I'm Gregory Pence. This is my personal YouTube channel, Great Stories in Bioethics. You would think that everybody would be pro life extension, not just tech billionaires, but some of the people who've written about it are anti-life extension. The late bioethicist Dan Callahan, a founder of the Hastings Center for Bioethics, he thought mortality sharpened our values because we were finite. We couldn't do everything we would otherwise be able to do. Atul Gawande, writing about mortality, also thinks that a sense of mortality gives life meaning. Philosopher and Stoic Seneca, thousands of years ago, argued that life extension was foolish because humans waste 90% of their life on foolish things like watching TV and too much social media. And if they lived twice as long, they would just waste twice as much of their life. Seneca praised conversation with friends, pleasant hikes, moderate eating. This was what he thought, gardening, that people ignored. So for Seneca, you should stop and smell the roses now, enjoy what time you have, and not fantasize about living twice as long. The philosopher and ethicist and physician Ezekiel Emanuel recently wrote an important essay in The Atlantic where he said that after 75, he was not going to have any tests for like prostate enlargement or heart function because if death came, so be it. He didn't want to have an extra 10 years or 20 years like some of his father's friends where they just had a very high symptom burden and it was just one terrible tale after another as they slowly slid down to death. I think maybe Emanuel made a mistake. He should have looked at it. A 1999 paper by J.E. Graham and Associates, where they made an important distinction between chronological aging and functional aging. Graham wanted to redefine aging as only functional aging. As you lost abilities, that was his measure of aging. But if you kept your abilities, you were in some sense young. So a 50-year-old who couldn't dress himself, who couldn't walk a block, who had trouble breathing, might be functionally the equivalent of 90, whereas an 80-year-old man who could run a marathon might be functionally equivalent to a 40 or 50-year-old. And what we want, of course, of life extension is functional aging, not mere chronological aging or a couple extra decades filled with misery. There is some evidence that what makes us age is the shortening of telomeres, which are nucleotides, repeating nucleotides at the end of chromosomes, kind of like the little plastic tips on shoelaces. If we could do gene therapy to stop the shortening of telomeres, either in fetuses in utero or later as adults, we might be able to stop aging at a cellular level. And that is really important because there's a whole host of diseases that seem to come in, like diabetes and cancer, arthritis, because of cellular aging. What if we could do gene therapy and have some people live to 150? We need to think about how that would affect other people. If it was only available to the rich, that would certainly create a lot of envy and resentment on people who had to die, say, at 65 or 75. We would have what the philosopher John Davis called entrenched elders. In academia, people got tenure and they could be there for 50 years. What if they could be there for 100 years? On one hand, it might create problems. On one hand, it might also have a lot of people who had a lot of institutional memory and wisdom. It could cut both ways. But there are other problems with people living this long because it would be a kind of biological inequality. I mean, social and economic inequality is bad enough, but stuff written in the genes, biological inequality, is much deeper and harder to accept. And if you were wise and you made prudent investments, biological inequality for people who live long might allow you to get really rich by making the right investments. So it might exacerbate economic inequality. Let's wait a minute. It matters a lot whether other people live a long time too. If you were the only one who lived to 150, that may not be so much fun. If your spouse died at 75, if you outlived all your children and grandchildren, that would be very sad. And you would progressively see all the people around you you cherish die. Even if you were functionally the equivalent of 40 and living to 150, that would be very, very sad. And you would probably see a lot of mistakes in society. So it's not clear that just you living longer would be a good thing. But what if a bunch of people live to 150? Would that be a good thing? It would certainly change the way we think about some things. Again, to quote the philosopher John Davis, the death burden of death would change. So if you murdered someone at 30 who might have lived to 150, is that much worse than murdering someone of a normal, natural lifespan? If someone with lifelong anorexia commits suicide at 50, but she could have lived to 150, is that morally much worse? Extra life changes the way we think about things. It would certainly change life insurance tables because you would pay premiums for a lot longer. Maybe you wouldn't even get life insurance. I don't know. More people living longer would certainly affect retirement systems and pensions. The original age of 65 is kind of arbitrary. When Bismarck funded the first retirement system in 1889 in Germany, he set the age at 70 because he didn't think many people would live to 70. Later in World War I, it was when so many people died, it was dropped to 65. But again, even in 1914, they didn't think many people would live to 65 and actually collect a pension. So they didn't fund it in that way. Now we have all kinds of people living past 65, people living into their 80s and 90s, even 100. And of course, the system is under strain. But if they started to live to 150, it would be tremendous pressure on our pensions and financial systems. Contrary to myth, Social Security and Medicare are not savings accounts. They are funded out of the taxes on people who are working. It's a revolving door. And if there are more people at the end taking out than people putting in, then the system is going to go bankrupt. So we would need to do something about that. We might also need to do something about people having a lot of children. I'm ambivalent about this. Davis thinks we might have to limit the number of descendants somebody created. They might flood the world with too many people with their genes. I'm not so sure about that. If you created a lot of people, you might care for a lot of your descendants, grandchildren, great-children, and have a lot of skin in that game and care much more and provide for them. So it could cut both ways. It is true that the last decades of life now are expensive and costs society a lot. If a lot of people used a lot of medical resources in extra decades, that creates a problem of intergenerational justice, where healthy young people have to pay more and more for life extension and services for elderly people. And we see some of this in Japan, which has, on average, the world's oldest people, where there's just so many people living a long time and not enough young people being created, that there's getting to be an imbalance. But let's switch now to a little bit different part of life extension. What about immortality? What if we could live forever and only die by choice? In a famous essay, the Oxford philosopher Bernard Williams, the essay was called The Macropolis Case, Tedium Boredom of Immortality. Williams argued that although death is bad, immortality would be worse. He basically thought that because our time is limited, not all our desires can be fulfilled. Fulfilling our desires gives life meaning and satisfaction. But if we had an infinite amount of time, we could have an infinite number of careers, an infinite number of projects. It would start to become meaningless and boring after a while. I might also add that if you lived forever and other people didn't, you would probably see a lot of dictatorships, a lot of economic collapse, a lot of silly wars, a lot of foolish things that humans do, natural catastrophes, and it would just get kind of boring after a while. The foolishness of the human race. It makes a lot of difference whether you live forever or whether everybody you know live forever. I do think Williams is right that if only you live forever, it would be horrible because you would soon see your first spouse die, your second and third, all your children, your grandchildren die. Pretty soon, everybody you knew would die, and you're the only one that's immortal. If you live long enough, everything you knew about human society would cease to exist. Or you'd probably be taken over by AI or aliens. You know, it might be gigantic jellyfish or some form of life based on computers or radiation, but it wouldn't be anything you could relate to, and you wouldn't want that life. And you wouldn't want to be stuck where you couldn't die. So he's right about that. Interestingly, this question about immortality and what it's like also indirectly raises questions about theology and immortality. If in Christianity we believe in bodily resurrection, it raises the question, if you're living forever, exactly what can the body do? Can we have sex? Can we create children? Can we eat? What happens to the food we eat? These are not usually questions that are answered in theology. If we don't have a body, we have disembodied existence forever, what do we do all day? Do we have a sense of time? Can we have a sense of space without a body? There's a great philosopher named Terence Penellam who explored some of those questions. But that's for theology, not for today. Finally, an unexpected consequence of life extension, whether it's 150 years or 3,000, is that it might magnify our virtues and vices. If you were a fool, you might make an infinite number of foolish choices. If you were prudent and a good saver, you might start out with a small savings account and over the centuries become a very, very wealthy person. We would have to do something about psychopaths. Maybe they couldn't kill people, but they could still do a lot of harm. We might have to confine them. Tolstoy tells us that happy families are all happy in the same way. So loving families would have many happy reunions. Tolstoy also tells us that unhappy families are unhappy in their own particular way. And if you came from a dysfunctional family, your reunions and interactions may be a long, long journey of pain and misery. On the positive side, if everybody could reasonably be expected to live to 150, everybody would have a lot more skin in the game about how the future looks. We wouldn't want a planet that looks like Blade Runner. We want to care about the environment. We want to care about the economic stability of our systems. We want to have a more equitable world where there weren't some people with too much and other people with nothing. That's just too unstable. It wouldn't be just people with grandchildren who cared about the future, but everybody. So that might be a good thing. If these questions fascinate you, I recommend a classic old science fiction novel by Robert Heinlein called Methuselah's Children. It's a great read. And there's actually a society called the Libertarian Futures Society that gives an award every year to people who think about longevity in the future. They have an archive. I'll post a link to its blog in the comments. And finally, some of the ideas in this essay came from a book that's just been written by a philosopher named John Davis called The New Methuselahs, The Ethics of Life Extension. Shameless self-promotion, an article I published called Should I Want to Live to 100 in a Journal of Bioethics. Anyway, that's it for today. I hope I asked some interesting questions and got you to think a little. That's it for now until next Tuesday at 4 p.m.